Hi, and welcome to this primary staff meeting on relationship, sex and health education. My name is Catherine Kirk and I'm RSHE leader with the Lead Equate Teaching School Alliance, working on behalf of the Department for Education to disseminate RSHE training across the East Midlands and the North. So in this session, we're going to be looking at the requirements of the new statutory framework for RSHE and thinking about how we deliver RSHE in a safe and inclusive way to benefit all pupils, and also thinking about how we might answer children's questions around RSHE. So in the new guidance which came out in 2019, this is what it says about the aims of RSHE. And in primary school, really, we're building those foundations around learning about friendships and being healthy, both physically and mentally. And we're supporting the wider work in schools around pupil wellbeing, and also helping children to learn effectively and be happy and successful members of society. Now, the guidance came out in 2019 and became statutory in September 2020. The Department for Education have issued a grace period until summer 2021, which is when all schools will need to be compliant with the new framework. So before we move on, what's really important is for the RSHE framework to be fully embedded and firmly embedded within the ethos and values of individual schools. So what I like to do in groups is to think about your provision of RSHE or PSHE, whatever you choose to call it, and what is it that you want pupils to know, to understand? What skills do you want them to have by the time that they leave your school? So if you can have a quick discussion in your groups around that, and pause the video now. Okay, so hopefully you've had some discussion and come up with some ideas about what you would want children to know and understand around RSHE, and also the sorts of values and attitudes and skills that you'd hope to develop. So I've noted some down here, some of which you may have discussed. And there are lots because it's a very broad topic. So we're thinking about puberty and supporting children with the physical and emotional changes of puberty and how to deal with these, keeping themselves safe, whether that be online or in the real world. Facts about drugs, feeling good about themselves, so that development of self-esteem and self-worth, amongst many others. And it's important that as a school, you really think about what is it that's important for our pupils? Where do we want our focus to be? And RSHE should fit firmly within your ethos as a school. So the evidence base for personal social health education. Now RSHE fits really within that umbrella of PSHE. The PSHE Association in 2017 published a document called A Curriculum for Life, and it was really making the case for statutory PSHE. And you can see here some of the evidence that's included in that, and really shows why this subject is so important. So firstly, thinking about children's health behaviours and then supporting them to make positive choices, whether that be around diet or whether that be around substance use in later years. Also thinking about bullying and violence and reducing that within school settings and outside of school settings. Where we know that when children receive comprehensive relationships and sex education, particularly that the information around bodies and privacy and what's private, what's not, how to seek help, that they are more likely, if they're being abused, to disclose that and to seek support. We can also reduce stigma. So there's positive signs around that reduction of stigma around mental health and emotional well-being. Particularly important at the moment where young people might be experiencing poor mental health because of the issues associated with COVID. And then if we were to think about schools as only settings for academia and improving children's academic learning, it's been shown that good PSHE can support children in terms of achieving their full potential and being able to access learning effectively. So really strong evidence base there for why we need to do PSHE, and I'm sure that you could come up with loads of other reasons why it's important for your school. During their primary years then, young people might experience any or all of these things here. So bereavement, family breakdown, I'm going to list all of these, you can have a look through as I'm talking. A global pandemic, obviously no one was expecting that. But all of these things might be things that young people experience as they make their way through their primary education. And the purpose of PSHE or RSHE is really to help them with that, to give them the skills, the confidence, the knowledge, the access to support systems to enable them to deal effectively with some of these potential challenges. So we're going to do a quick quiz, and the quiz focuses on the new framework. So what we're going to do is, if you think the answer is true, you're going to put your hand up. If you think it's false, you're going to keep your hand down. So the first statement is, schools can choose whether or not, excuse me, to have a written policy for relationships and sex education. So if you think that's true, put your hand up, and if you think it's false, keep your hand down. So that one is false. So all schools need to have a written policy on relationships and sex education, and you'll notice that that only says RSE. So the requirement is for an RSE policy. However, as the new framework includes health education, and you might be doing other aspects that come under PSHE, personal social health education, it makes sense really to have them all as one policy, because a lot of the content for RSE would be similar, in terms of delivery, for example, inclusive delivery would be the same for RSHE. So you do need to have a policy, and that was in the previous guidance. So the previous guidance that we had around RSE was from 2000, so considerably out of date now, but in there, there's always been a requirement to have a policy. Next one, the new guidance makes relationship, sex and health education statutory in primary and secondary schools. Is that true? Put your hand up. Or is it false? Keep your hand down. That one is false. So, relationships and health education are statutory in both. Sex education is only statutory, excuse me, in secondary, although it is recommended in both. So for primary schools, they can choose to provide sex education that is over and above the content that's included in relationships and health education. Okay, next one. The religious background of all pupils must be taken into account when planning RSHE teaching. If you think that's true, put your hand up, and if you think it's false, put your hand down. It is True. So in the guidance, it does state that schools need to be taking into account the religious background of all pupils. Schools can reflect diverse faith perspectives within RSHE, and they must also reflect the law. So we must be compliant with the Equality Act 2010, which means that we need to be reflecting content and delivering in a way that is inclusive of all of the protected characteristics that are mentioned in the Equality Act. And one of those is faith. So we do need to be inclusive of different faith perspectives. Okay, next one. Schools must deliver the content of RSHE in units of manageable size in a carefully sequenced way within a planned programme of lessons. Do we think that's true? Put your hand up. Do we think it's false? Hands down. Okay, that one is true. So it does offer some flexibility within the new framework for schools to plan their programmes. So you don't have to have a weekly, hourly session. It's not that restrictive. You can deliver through a cross-curricular approach. You can include things like your assembly provision. If you do themed days or themed weeks or fundraising, anything like that will contribute to the RSHE outcomes and delivery of those. So you have quite a bit of flexibility, but it does need to be progressive, and young people do need to be learning in a spiral curriculum so that they progress as they move through their primary school years. Okay, primary schools should not cover LGBT plus identity, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender identities. I think that's true. Put your hand up if you think it's false. Keep your hand down. That one is false. So it's very clear in the RSHE guidance that there's an expectation that at secondary level there will be some LGBT content. And it also says that primary schools are enabled and encouraged to deliver LGBT content at a timely point in an integrated manner. And if we think about the primary curriculum, there are lots of different areas where that might be covered. So we don't have to have a separate lesson on LGBT identities. But for example, if we're talking about different families, we might be looking at the fact that there are families with two mums or two dads, or thinking about the vast array of different family types that there are. If we're thinking about marriage, likewise, respect for other people, so that would feed into making sure that young people recognise that people are different. We're all individuals. We have different views, values, identities, and also through our anti-bullying work as well. Next one, RSHE should only be delivered by specialists or external agencies. Do we think that's true? Put your hand up. Or false? Keep your hand down. That one is false. So we might invite some specialist agencies or deliverers in to deliver part of the curriculum, but what they should be doing is complementing what is already there. So the provision that's delivered by teachers. So it shouldn't be seen as a replacement, but more of an addition, sort of a new experience for the children. Teachers delivering don't have to be specialists. They should have some training, but they don't have to be specialists. And, they are best placed really to deliver to children, because they know the children that are in their class. Okay, schools should hold exams to monitor progress in RSHE. Do we think that's true? Put your hand up. Or false? Keep your hand down. Okay, thankfully, That's false. We don't want to be having exams. So there's no formal, no requirement for formal examination, but there should be the same rigour of assessment as in other subjects. So we need to be making sure that children are making progress, otherwise what's the point of teaching? But there are creative ways that we might do that. So for example, we could do some kind of brainstorm or draw and write activity at the start of a topic, and then at the end of a topic, children can add to that. So showing their learning, or they could cross bits out, or change bits. We might be doing role play, photographing role play and annotating it, or videoing role play to look at skills development. So how do we support someone who's fallen over on the playground, or how do we resolve a conflict between friends? We could be doing creative work, so creating displays, and again photographing that's a part of the evidence. It shows what children have learnt or taken from the teaching. So think creatively, because it's not about increasing teachers' workload and massive long sort of checklists, etc. Although you may want to think about a RAG rating system. You may want to think about self-assessment, or teachers just marking off on a topic sheet, working towards working out, exceeding, etc. So lots of different ways that we might do that. Next, parents can withdraw their child from RSHE at secondary level until 3 terms before their 16th birthday. Do you think that's true or false? Okay, that is false. So parents can only withdraw from the sex education elements. So this is a difference from the legislation we had previously. Now, it's up to a school to decide what parts they are. In a primary, it would usually be the elements that we have some schools would deliver in year 6. So the sort of birth, reproduction, birth, conception, all of that kind of content. That would be classed as sex education. That would be non-statutory, and parents could withdraw from that element. And you can see as they go up to secondary then, parents can withdraw until 3 terms before a child's 16th birthday, when the child can decide to go into sessions. And this is slightly different, because before, in primary, parents would have been able to withdraw from any RSE, and that might have included things around learning around puberty, for example, and that has changed now. Inspectors will evaluate how well PSHE and RSE contribute to pupils' personal development. Do you think that's true? Put your hand up. Or false? It is true. So in the new Ofsted inspection framework, when inspections begin again, so from summer 2021, Ofsted inspectors will be looking at this area and ensuring that schools are compliant with the new framework. There are set learning outcomes that primary schools have to achieve in their provision of relationships and health education. Do we think that's true? Put your hand up. Do we think it's false? Keep your hand down. It is true. However, as we've talked about before, there is flexibility within this to design a curriculum that meets the needs of your pupils. So there are some set learning outcomes, which I have summarised on the following slides. But for example, depending on your area, you may want to put more focus on a particular topic, or depending on your class. It may be that you're having lots of issues around children doing things online that aren't safe, or around friendships, and you could put more focus on that area, because that is what meets the needs of children. So as long as within your the child's school career they cover all of those topics or outcomes, there is flexibility within that for planning. So here are the topics then. So we start with relationships education, and the first one is respectful relationships. So thinking about respect, courtesy and manners, respect for themselves as well as for others. And this is where anti-bullying work comes in, thinking about stereotypes and addressing challenging stereotypes. And permission seeking, which is the sort of foundations of consent. So can I play with you? Can I hold your hand? Can I borrow your ruler? How do we ask for permission? How do we give permission? And making also encouraging children to know they can say no as well. They don't have to give permission if they don't want to. Then we have families and caring friendships. So thinking about the diversity of families, marriage and civil partnerships. So some of this might link in with if you do your RE curriculum, how they seek help if they're unhappy. And then friendships. So a lot of the work that we do at primary is around friendships and supporting children to have safe, happy friendships, resolving friendship issues. And thinking about what makes a good friend. Next we have online relationships, so supporting children to learn about how to behave online, the difference between real life and online friendships, and how to be critical of online friendships. And then being safe. So the being safe part would be where naming of genitals comes in, the fact that they are private parts, safe and unsafe touch, privacy and secret. So all of that stuff around keeping children safe and how they access help and support would be within that section. Then moving on to health education, we have mental well-being. Great that this is now statutory part of the curriculum, and I'm sure you've done lots of work on this previously. Those of you that remember the SEAL programme, all about feelings and identifying feelings, etc. So important. So you could, if you're not already still using some of that, dust it off the shelf if you've got it, and you might be able to find some bits that are useful here. And you can see with this that there are clear links between, so you don't have to have these in separate topics. When we're talking about friendships, we might also touch on bullying or anti-bullying, and thinking about the impact of bullying here. So for example, if we're doing some scenarios around friendships or bullying scenarios, how does that impact on somebody's well-being? Where do they go for help? What might it mean now? What might it mean in the future in terms of their well-being? How would they seek help with that? So a lot of them cross over and can be covered together rather than separately. And then you've got more of the safety information around the internet, and both the benefits and the risks, and how we make sure that we are discerning customers and consumers of information online. And again, links here. So sometimes when I'm talking about puberty with children, I'll ask them where would they get more information about puberty, and I'd usually present that in sort of a problem text from a child. I don't know enough, where would I get more information? And exploring what would be an appropriate source, and that not everything online is accurate, and that some of it comes from, if they're watching vloggers, for example, it's coming from a particular perspective, a personal perspective, rather than factual. So it's just about being critical and bearing that in mind. Okay, and then we've got physical health and healthy eating, linking there with your PE curriculum, your daily mile, anything you're doing sports-wise in school, walking to school, those sort of challenges that some schools do. And then healthy eating, thinking about a healthy diet, could link in with your science and healthy schools work around lunchbox, healthy lunchboxes, etc. Drugs, alcohol and tobacco, thinking about legal and illegal substances, so maybe touching on tobacco, alcohol, thinking about medicines and safety with medicines with younger children. and what medicines are used for, which links in again with health and prevention, which is the next one. Sun safety, good quality sleep, again linking with your mental health. So you can see how there's lots of links there. So, you know, don't try and kind of do them separately, because you can kind of touch on bits in different topics, bring them together. And then facts related to allergies, immunisation and vaccination, another important one at the moment. Health education, basic first aid. So it's basic. You've got the concepts of basic first aid and how to make an emergency call. And that could be, you know, right from the very littlies, thinking about how they dial 999, what they might say, when they would do that. And then, you know, when they need to seek help, how they deal with common things like bites, stings, that kind of thing. And then changing adolescent body. So as I said, the puberty information now comes within health education, so it's statutory and parents can't withdraw from that. And that's information about the emotional and physical changes and how to deal with that, those changes effectively. And then the non-statutory sex education. So the DfE continue to recommend that it is should be a key part of the comprehensive RSHE programme, and that it should be tailored to the needs of pupils. It's usually the bit that's done in year 6, sex after SATs, but it can be done anytime during the year, and it can be done in earlier year groups if that meets the needs of your students. So how a baby is conceived and born, linking in with the life cycle information that comes within the science curriculum. So some basic principles, some of these I will have touched on already. RSHE and PSHE should be a partnership with parents and carers, and your coordinator or head will have done some work with parents, or will be soon to be doing work with parents around consultation with them, ensuring they know what's in the curriculum. But as teachers, again, you might get questions from parents or carers about what's being covered, or they might have concerns, or they might come to you with, you know, things that are happening for their child that they think would be useful to explore within RSHE. So it's about making sure that we're working in partnership. We are seeing parents as being able to support our work in school, because actually what we deliver in school is a relatively small part of what children need. Based on the needs of pupils, so we find out what the needs of pupils are, but we can also use some of our other data, so public health data in local communities, rates of obesity, for example, safeguarding information from school, obviously anonymous data, but what is that telling us about what children need, previous RSHE that they've received, what was the feedback from pupils. It should be accessible to those with special educational needs and disabilities, so making sure that they can access the programme effectively, that it's being delivered in a way that they can access, which might be smaller chunks and repeated more regularly, might be working individually with a support worker, a TA, to get some of those key concepts that might be more difficult with a child with SEND. Regular and progressive, so making sure that core knowledge is broken down. We've got that spiral curriculum, we're building on it through the year and year on year. It reflects the law, and we'll think about why that's important in a moment. Talked about that one. Sensitive and age appropriate. It's always a tricky one, that what is age appropriate, and some of the work that we do with parents and carers might support that. But you know those pupils in your class, and you know your experienced teachers, and know you know the levels that children are working at. Flexible, so you know when something comes up, can we bring that into our programme at short notice, and make sure that it's relevant, keeping it up to date. Train teachers. Now, obviously, this is part of your training, but there are lots of other options that you can find if you need more in-depth support. The DFE have published some modules. So each of the topics within RSHE has a set of slides, so a slide deck, and it gives you more information on the types of things that you would bring in under those topics. So they're quite useful to just have a look at before you deliver. And within the Equalities Act, we are allowed to give specific support or content around RSHE to those with particular protected characteristics where we notice that there's a need. So we've already talked about children with SEND who might need a different approach, and that wouldn't be discriminating against other children to do that. If you identify that there's a group of boys that are playing on a particular game that is kind of impacting on their behaviour at school, or if there's a group of girls who are doing that, we can put in a particular input and not be outside of the requirements of the Equalities Act. So what I'd like you to do is just to think about your provision of RSHE. So when you're delivering, who or what do you need to be inclusive of, and how do we make sure that our delivery is safe and inclusive for all? So if you'd like to discuss that in your teams, and then pause the video and we'll come back. Okay, so hopefully you've had a discussion around who or what we need to be inclusive of. I've just made a list here of identities, experiences, backgrounds that we might need to think about when we're delivering RSHE. And it's important to think about a child in your class. How are they experiencing the RSHE that you're providing? So, for example, the child that's extremely embarrassed, what can we do to support them in their to be included in RSHE? Can we have some kind of icebreaker to sort of maybe get some of those feelings and anxiety out of the way? Can we allow them the opportunity to opt out? Likewise, with a child who's experienced a bereavement, how are they going to experience a lesson, particularly if it's around bereavement? How can we support them, whether that's having a discussion with them beforehand? Doesn't necessarily mean they have to be taken out of the session. It may just be that they need additional support, or you might want to run through with them how the session is going to run, what's going to come up, etc. And it's really important that we give some consideration to this, so we don't inadvertently upset a child or not include a child. If we're thinking about talking about families, for example, are we representing all of the family backgrounds that exist in our class, but also outside of that? So yeah, just something to think about in terms of inclusion, and it's broader, I think, than just the protected characteristics. It's about background, it's about identity and experiences as well. So how do we ensure the inclusion and safety of all? Again, you've probably had some ideas around this. First of all, having boundaries or rules. So having a group agreement or ground rules at the start of sessions or topics is really important. And they shouldn't just be a tick box exercise. They should be really meaningful in the sessions. We should refer back to them. We should spend time developing them with children so that they have ownership, and also exploring some of the rules. So if we say show respect for all, what does that mean? How do we show respect? How do we say how we feel about something but not upset somebody else? You know, so maybe using I statements. So I feel this, my family feel this, my faith believes this, and it's not presented as a fact, but as a, you know, you're owning that statement. How do we show kindness to others? How do we ensure that everybody's included? And we can keep referring back to that. So as well as being a sort of, you know, showing the boundaries and the rules, it's also developing the skills of children, you know, relationship skills. We've talked about that one, being mindful of range of identities and experience, being factual, balanced and objective. So we're not giving our personal viewpoint, we're sharing facts, and being balanced and, you know, representing that there are a range of different views and perspectives that people might have that may or may not be shared with those in the in the class, but that they are there and represent the world that we live in. You might want to play devil's advocate at some point and give an alternative viewpoint. So maybe say, you know, someone I know believes this, or you know, my friend believes that. So you're bringing in and representing those who may not be present in the room. Acknowledge the weirdness. It can be, you know, some children might be really weirded out by RSHE. They might find it really uncomfortable and difficult to deal with, and it's worth acknowledging that, you know, and just bringing that out into the open, allowing them the opportunity to just breathe and, you know, just know that other people might be feeling the same way. Notice body language. So when we're delivering, not just what children say, but how they're looking. And I'm sure you do this all of the time when you're teaching. But, you know, if that child looks particularly uncomfortable in this session and they're not normally, is that signifying an issue? Do you need to have a word with them afterwards? And we've talked about reflecting the law and using inclusive resources. So if you have a scheme maybe that you've bought into, or one that you've used for a number of years, how inclusive is it? Do you need to put in additional parts to make sure it's inclusive for your school environment? Do you want to seek out additional resources to bring in to make sure that, you know, it is fully inclusive? Have you got different storybooks showing a range of people and relationships? We should always signpost to appropriate support, and that's both in school, encouraging children to speak to trusted grown-ups at home, but also external sources of support like Childline, for example. So making sure children know that they do have access to people outside of those settings if they need it. Using someone I know, and encourage the children to do that as well as yourself. So they're not sharing their personal, you know, they're not sharing information that belongs to somebody else, or, you know, naming people. Promoting non-stereotypical views and gently challenging stereotypes, so that young people see that you know, that there are lots of different options and lots of different ways that people can be. We don't have to subscribe to stereotypes. Reflecting a range of relationships and identities, so through your curriculum, through your environment, displays, books, etc. Differentiating the content, we've talked about that for children with SEND, those with EAL, etc. We need to make sure that we are meeting the needs of all pupils. And then a range of activities. So, you know, not just worksheets, you know, being active, being creative, you know, role play, discussion, you know, that's where the sort of richness of PSHE comes in, that we can have those great discussions and group working. And then being open yourself to the fact that, you know, there will be a range of different views potentially in the class or as a staff group, and just being open to that. And it goes without saying that we would follow up any concerns. So if we've noticed, you know, a child looks uncomfortable, if they've said something, if they've asked a question and we're concerned, we'd want to obviously follow that up. So in terms of reflecting diverse values and beliefs in our RSHE, First thing, going back to what we were saying about our group agreement, is supporting children to develop their communication skills and spending time thinking about appropriate comments and what might be hurtful and how they can express their own views, and also recognise that other people might have different views. So we can acknowledge that there's a vast range and identify some of those that are shared across communities. So, for example, some things are shared across faith, perhaps things like commitment, honesty, being kind to each other, that kind of thing, that are common values that we can identify. And then sharing different perspectives and also the law. So we might say some people believe that sex should only take place within a marriage. Some people believe that sex can take place within a loving relationship between two adults. The law says that people can choose to have sex from the age of 16. So if you're delivering sex education, you might want to include something like that. If we're thinking about LGBT relationships, again, in terms of marriage, we might say some faiths only recognise marriage between a man and a woman, and some people believe that men and men, women and women can have loving, caring, supportive married relationships. The law says that anyone can get married to over the age of 16 with parental permission, or over the age of 18. So it's kind of reflecting those different viewpoints, but also coming back to what the law says. And you might want to bring in some of the celebrations and customs associated with different faiths and cultures. So, for example, those around adolescence and coming of age and puberty, and reflecting what that means in different communities. And you might be able to get some help from your parents around that, things that they would like to be reflected and brought into your programme. So here's a sample group agreement. So you see at the top there, ask questions but not personal ones. We don't want children to be asking personal questions of teachers, particularly around RSHE. And it's good to set that from the beginning, and also of their fellow students as well, because some aspects can be sensitive, people might not want to share. So any question is great as long as it's around the content and not personal. Use language appropriate for the classroom. So if we're talking about scientific words for genitals, for example, we might want to encourage children to use that in the school setting so that everybody understands what they're talking about. Using someone I know, and then reinforcing with children around confidentiality, that although we can have discussions and they can be confidential up to a point, if you hear something and think they're at risk in any way, that would need to be shared. And it's important to let children know that, so that we're aware of what the boundaries are. Okay, so we'll come on to questions. Now, I often find that this is an area where staff feel less confident, or it might make them feel anxious going into lessons. What are those questions going to be that children ask? How am I going to respond? Is how I'm responding okay in terms of parents, etc.? So what I like to do is, in groups, just have a think about any tricky questions that you've had previously, or ones that you can anticipate students asking in RSHE lessons, and what strategies you might employ to deal with those questions. So if you want to pause the video now and just have a discussion around questions that might come up on different topics. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to think about some questions, maybe had a laugh at some of the questions that people have had before. The first thing to remember is that you don't have to have all of the answers. There may be questions that you don't know the answer to, and you can go away and have a look and come back, and then next time you will know the answer to that question. And having taught this subject for 20 years, it's, you know, every year I deliver, there is a new question that the children come up with. So it's part of the fun. So some strategies then, you may have come up with some already yourselves. Breathe. Just take a deep breath. Don't feel you have to answer immediately. Do some planning beforehand. You know, if you're doing a particular topic, not that children always ask questions when they're, you know, on topic, they might come up at a random time. But let's think about in RSHE, plan. So if you're doing a session on diverse families, what might come up, what questions might come up, what statements might come up, how would you respond? So you can do some planning either as a staff or individually. We've talked about the rules and no personal questions. Know your policy. So what does it say in your policy around how questions will be answered? Because that is what will guide provision. That is what parents will have, you know, they'll know that that's how you're going to answer questions. Usually it will say something around, you know, they'll be answered in a balanced and factual way, in an age appropriately. And, you know, that will vary from, you know, teach child to child, depending on the needs of the child and the maturity of that child. Okay, give yourself time. So that's a really interesting question. I'm going to come back to that at the end of the session. So make sure that you know, if you find a question really difficult, give yourself a bit of time to think about how to answer that in an age-appropriate way. Utilise your question box. So have a question box at the front or on the children's tables that they can post their questions in. Now, sometimes it's referred to as an anonymous question box. I always say to ask children to put their names on. You don't have to read their names out, but just to make sure that if a safeguarding issue comes out from that you know who's asked the question. I mean, you might recognise the writing, but I would always just still, you know, for safety, get children to write their names. And it allows you to kind of group questions together, to have a bit more time, maybe to seek advice of another member of staff. And, you know, for older children, it works quite well. For younger ones, you might want to plan a time in the session for questions. Okay, we're going to have our 10-minute question time now, but it might be more likely that the questions are just kind of going to come up as you go through. Hopefully they won't be as in-depth as some of the older pupils. The other thing is, I've seen in some schools where they've got a code that the child can put on their question when they're writing it to say whether they want it answered individually or as a group. And again, you could utilise something like that. You might choose to answer individually. So if the questions come up in a question box, you could answer individually if you choose to. I think the important thing is, if a question has been asked out in the open, I think you kind of need to find some way to answer it, just because what we don't want is children going away and Googling it, particularly if it's kind of, you know, a question about sex or something that we wouldn't want them to be searching for online. So find a way of answering it in a safe way. And what I sometimes do is to have like a sort of stock statement of how I will answer questions. So, for example, I quite often get questions around sexual practice. So different sexual practices, what are they, and why do people do that? How do two men have sex? How do two women have sex? And actually, at this in this age group, what you'd want to be doing is to kind of just reinforcing some key messages. So, for example, when two adults are in a loving and caring relationship, or when they're married, they might choose to touch each other in different ways. That's between those two people, what feels good for them, and that they've both agreed to that, and they both feel comfortable. So you're reinforcing some of those key messages around consent, around the age at which sex takes place, and around privacy. And, you know, you're not going into detail about particular things. You could use post-its, talked about that in a factual way. Use your questions to plan future input. So it's quite a good way of evaluating your session. If you're getting a lot of questions about a particular topic that's not covered, or a particular thing within your topic, you might want to use that to plan for future. So do we need to put this into our sessions in future? And then obviously always being alert to any safeguarding or child protection concerns that come through children's questions or statements. So just to sort of bring it all back, not that we should always be focused on what Ofsted want, but this is around good practice and making sure that we're delivering something that's quality. And I think this is quite a good way of thinking about the quality of what we're delivering. So in some of the deep dives that happened before the lockdown, these are some of the questions that teachers reported being asked. So why do you teach what you do? How do you know it's relevant? Should have a question mark on that. How does the curriculum progress? How do those areas tie together? So it's really about kind of, evidence. Why are you doing what you're doing? We'd be able to do that in any other subject. So why are we doing it in this? Some of them looked in books across year groups. You don't have to have books, but some way of collecting evidence of pupils' work would be a good idea. How do you track progress? How are you building resilience? So thinking about maybe character building of students as well. So there might be specific questions around different aspects of RSHE. Being aware of strengths and weaknesses. So, where's your curriculum strong? Where do you still need to develop? And again, that might be a question that's asked of a coordinator. And then having some kind of folder of evidence to show. Where is your RSHE delivered via those cross-curricular links? How are you making those connections for children? So yeah, important, just a way of kind of thinking and knowing, do I know why I'm doing this lesson? Is it because the scheme we've chosen tells me to, or is it because I know that it's relevant to the children that I'm teaching? And then finally, this is so important. I mean, it's more important than ever in this current situation that we're in. It's vital for children that they have some way of kind of learning about these aspects, thinking about relationships, thinking about maybe how they've changed over the COVID period. What does it feel like now we can't get so close to people, and how has that affected us? And our role as educators is to support children to make sense of that, and make sense of the past few months. Okay, so some top tips. Often I find that teachers become very de-skilled when it comes to RSHE, and actually, remember, you are a skilled teacher. It may be an unfamiliar subject for some of you, but you have the skills. You don't need to be reliant on a particular scheme. Use your your creative teaching skills. Value the subject, give it some priority and prominence. It hasn't always had the prominence that it really deserves, because you can make a real difference to a child's life. I remember doing some work around domestic abuse with some children in a primary school, and afterwards one of the children came up and said that they didn't realise that was wrong. So that was happening in their family and they hadn't realised that it was wrong, and that then that child is able then to get the support that they need, and knows what a healthy relationship looks like. Enjoy it, have fun, explore, experiment, use different resources, get the children discussing and enjoying it. And it's different in some ways to other subjects, that we can be more creative because we don't have, it's not so set in terms of what we need to deliver. There is some flexibility there. Prepare, so do research for what you're delivering, and then get support. So within school there might be some staff that are more confident than others. Perhaps you could buddy up, perhaps you could observe sessions, learn from each other, share good practice, maybe have a board of different activities you've used and what's worked, and just really get that sort of group feel to support everybody. Okay, that's the end. Thank you very much. I hope it's been useful.